Hey guys, welcome to our next session. I'm from the Salesforce Trailers team, and in today's session, we're gonna taking a look at some of the event propagation methods. In the last session, we looked at all the phases in the event propagation for component and application events. So today we're gonna be taking a deep dive into some of the propagation methods as to how we can stop the propagation of an event midway, or how can we pause and resume the propagation of an event. So in our last session, we set up an example with the propagation of events. So let us just revise that example a little bit. I had that example open in my org. So we had three components: the parent, then this is the child, and then this is the grandchild. So right now, all three of these are set up to send out a component event in the capture phase. So right now it's working according to the event propagation rules. That is, if I fire the event from the parent, only goes to the parent. Then if I fire it from the child, it goes from the parent to the child. Since we are obviously handling the capture phase, which travels top to bottom from the parent to the child components. And then lastly, we have this grandchild. In this case, it goes from the parent to the child and to the grandchild. So now, since we have already set up this example, in this session today, we're gonna talk about some of these methods. So the first method that we're gonna talk about is event.stop propagation. So this method is used to stop the propagation of an event further in the hierarchy or the travel path for that component event. So let's say if we fire an event from the grandchild, it travels from the parent to the child and then to the grandchild. So now let's assume what we want to do is we want to send the event from the parent to the child, but we want to stop it from moving to the child to the grandchild. So the way we'll use this event.stop propagation method is, let's go to our code. So we have the parent receiving the event here by the handler. Then we go to the child. It is also receiving this event by this handler. So in the receival of this event on the child component, we go to the action, to the JavaScript method, which is being called, which is called event receive. So right here, I'm gonna call that event dot stop propagation method. So what it will do is this is the syntax right here. Obviously, you can refer to our website for any syntaxes or examples. But what this will do is when our event reaches the child, it will stop the propagation of the event on the child level, and then that event will not travel further to the grandchild. So let's see this in action. Let's refresh our page. I call the event from the grandchild, it goes to the parent, it goes to the child, but it does not travel further along to the grandchild. The same way, I can remove this from here and instead I can stop it on the parent level itself. Let me go to the JavaScript function of the parent and just call it right here. So let me go back to our application and test it out. So if I fire from the grandchild, it goes to the parent, and then since the propagation is stopped itself on the parent level, the event does not travel onwards. So pretty simple, right? Just make sure that when you call this event.stop propagation, you want to stop all the phases and everything in the propagation. Since once you call this, there is no way to resume the propagation of this event. Now, after the event.stop propagation, we have two set of methods, event.pause and event.resume, and these are used together to pause the propagation of an event and then to resume that propagation of the same event. So why do we use these? So let's say you want to pause your event propagation and just based off some condition, you want to resume it in some cases and you don't want to resume it in other cases. So that is how you use these two events. We can use the same example like these or these ones as well, where what you can do is in the parent, let me do event dot pause, and I'm gonna let out event is paused, and then in the next line I can resume the event. So for example purposes, let me comment out the resume line for now so that it is just paused. You'll see it behaves the same way as the stop propagation method. So I'm gonna go to our example. Keep in mind we have put this event dot pause in our parent. So as soon as the parent receives it, it's not gonna allow the event to go further, propagate further, and it'll just pause the propagation of that event right here. So let me click this button. So it went to the parent end, and now you'll see the event is paused alert, and then the event does not travel any further in the hierarchy. But let me go back and uncomment this line. Now I can go back to my example and click on this button again. So you'll see the parent, then the event is paused. But then since we resume the event, you'll see it passed along to the child and then to the grandchild. So again, pretty simple. Uh, don't confuse this where if you pause this event here, so you can only resume the event in the same JavaScript method. Because or you can call a helper, but you need this event variable in order to resume it. You cannot do something like pausing it here, then having a button on the parent to resume it later. No, it's gonna be in the same browser ajax call or the same transaction, where if you pause it here you need to resume it in the same transaction. A good use case to use a pause and resume is, so let's say you want to receive an event in one of your components, then you want to call an backend Apex method. So by default, what happens is all backend calls are asynchronous. So your event will be passed along before you receive an output for the Apex call. So one thing you can do is, as soon as you receive the event, you pause it, then right here you call something to an Apex class, and when you receive the response from the Apex class, you can resume the event propagation so that the event only propagates further once you have received an output to your backend method call, right? So this is all there is for event.pause and event.resume. Now the last method that we're going to take a look at is event.prevent default. So this behaves a little differently. So what event.prevent default is used in standard JavaScript is to prevent the default behavior of certain standard JavaScript functions. But in the context of your Aura framework, what this event.prevent default does is it stops the method propagation in the next phase. So what I mean by that is, let's say we call the capture phase first, then the bubble phase for the case of component events, right? So if I call event.prevent default in the capture phase, since capture phase is ran first, then the Aura framework will complete the capture phase, but it will not run the bubble phase after the capture phase. So in order to properly demonstrate this method, let's make a little change in our component. So in the parent, I'm going to call event.prevent default. All right, when the parent receives that event. Now let me go back here, refresh our application, then again fire the event from the grandchild. So you'll see we see no difference here. The event still travels from the parent to the child and to the grandchild. So in order to demonstrate this, let me make some changes. In the parent, we're still gonna handle the event in the capture phase, but in the child and in the grandchild, we'll handle the event in the bubble phase. So it doesn't make that lot of a difference. And for now, I'm gonna comment out this event.prevent default line. So I'm gonna go back to my page, refresh the application. Again, start from the grandchild, so it goes to the parent. Now I'll go to the grandchild and then to the child, because the capture phase goes to the parent first, but in the bubble phase it goes to the grandchild and then upwards, right? So, but still it reaches all three of your components. But let me now call even.prevent default in the parent on the capture phase itself. So you'll notice something interesting now. If I call even.prevent default in the capture phase, then so we had a little mistake in the code, but yeah, so if I file from the grandchild now, so you'll see it goes to the parent in the default phase, in the capture phase, but it does not travel upwards in the bubble phase for the grandchild and the child component. So this is how you generally use the event.prevent default in the case of aura propagation. One quick thing of note is that if we call an event.prevent default in the case of application events, so it will not stop the propagation of the default phase, but otherwise it can stop the propagation of your bubble phase in the case of application events as well. So that's it, guys, for the event.prevent default method. So now, before we finish today's session, a really quick pointer on a standard event that we should all use. So that standard event is called your init event, and that is used to call a JavaScript function as soon as your component loads into a browser. So it's like an alternative for the constructor for an honor component, where you use the constructor in the VF page or the Visual Force page. So the way we use that is, since it's a standard event, so all you have to do is, and it is fired automatically every time, so all you need to do is write a handler for that event and then write a JavaScript function to be called for that event, and that will call your JavaScript function every time your component is loaded into the memory, and you should be able to do that pretty easily. So the syntax to do that is you write an aura handler. Obviously, you can have multiple aura handlers, and the name of that handler is init. Then you have to specify a value, which is exclamation mark this, and then lastly you need to specify an action which will point again to a JavaScript method in your aura component. So let's say I call it c.onload, and I'm going to define a method onload here. And let's put some code inside of it. For now, let's just put an alert inside of it. And I click on the save. So now every time I reload this page, you'll see an onload alert, because that method is being called as soon as our Aura component is loaded into the browser. So since it acts like a control or a constructor for your Aura component, you can do certain things like querying data, calling an Apex method to fetch data from the backend on this. And this is how you like bring on all the required information for your Aura component as soon as it loads in the memory. It works for all the component. I mean, I can define an init handler in my child and grandchild as well. So in that scenario, the init will be called separately for all three of my events. So you will see this alert 3 times. So let us quickly do that. I'm going to define this here in the child as well. Like this, and I'm going to define it in the grandchild as well. And then I'm gonna copy this method. Let's change this to parent. Then in the child controller, let's add this out. This is the onload child. And then lastly, let's add this in the grandchild. And let's call it grandchild. So now let me go back and refresh my page. So you see the first load method is called for the grandchild, then it is loaded for the child, and then it is loaded for the parent. So what that means is the aura component lowermost in the hierarchy is loaded first into the browser. So the grandchild is loaded first, then the child is loaded, then at the last the parent is loaded. So you guys need to keep that in mind while designing your aura components as well. So I hope you guys understood this little pointer using the init standard event. And I hope you guys understand all the other event propagation methods as well. So that is it for today's session. And I hope to see you guys in the next session as well. Keep learning.